1,000 messages that participants of the survey wanted to send to President Cyril Ramaphosa revealed that the three most prominent concerns for ordinary South Africans were about grants, jobs, and the economy. For more on this, I'm joined by the director of the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg, Carin Runciman. Carin, good to have you with us. Let's talk then about the 1,000 messages that you have received. Firstly, the sample, where did you get these messages from?
So the sample of messages to the President come from the findings of round 4 of the UJHSRC COVID-19 Democracy Survey, which had over 7,000 participants in this round. And we just took a sample of 1,000 to understand what people were really concerned about and what they wanted to raise with the President. And as you've said, the two main concerns were about grants, and particularly this was before the President made the announcement about the reintroduction of the Social Relief of Distress grant, and also concerns about jobs and the economy. So those were really the two key themes that came out of those messages.
Yeah. Analyzing those messages, talk to me about the grants intervention and whether or not the people would feel what the President announced would be the right amount in terms of intervention, but also it goes far enough as far as what their requirements are.
So the messages to the President, of course, can vary an awful lot, but what we can also tell from the survey is that there is a high degree of support for interventions to provide social protections, particularly during the pandemic. So there is a wide degree of support for the top-ups of social grants that were made initially, but were stopped towards the end of last year, and very high levels of support for the Social Relief of Distress grant, which has just been reintroduced as announced by the President. The question of the amount, of course, is a difficult one. Many people in their messages were saying, 350 rand is not enough, but at least it was something. It was something that was assisting people who had no other forms of income. And certainly the findings from the survey suggest that this, the reintroduction of the grant will be popularly supported. Yeah.
Breaking down those details, what influences the type of views that people are having, particularly around these interventions, particularly, as you're saying, the topping up of the social grants? Are these in any way political?
So what is interesting is when we look at the top-ups to the grants, women support those interventions slightly more than men. Those on lower incomes support them slightly more than those on higher incomes, although even amongst those on higher incomes, there is actually widespread support. For the top-ups to the grants, ANC supporters were actually most in support of those top-ups. But for instance, when we look at something like the introduction of a basic income grant, we actually found something quite interesting there. We found that DA supporters were actually most in favour of the introduction of a basic income grant, with ANC supporters having much lower levels of support, which kind of might go against our expectations and is something interesting that we need to probe further in the data.
So what do the public want as far as, okay, well, let's talk about jobs first, then we'll talk about the economy next. As far as jobs are concerned, what does the public say?
So there are huge concerns with unemployment in the messages to the President and asking the President to make interventions around creating jobs. Now, unfortunately, in those messages to the President, there aren't often perhaps ideas around that, but there is a clear demand that people want some kind of intervention. Now, whether this means, EPWP jobs, it's kind of harder to say from the information we got from participants. But it really does put, on the table the economic crisis that people are facing and the importance of the Social Relief of Distress grant, where people in their messages to the President were also saying how having that little bit of income was also assisting them to look for work. So these things are very closely interrelated. We can't talk about jobs without also thinking about other social protection measures.
Now, there are some rather important economic reforms that were introduced by the government a couple of months ago. One being, for example, that business now will be able to produce its own electricity, but things around SAA, for example, and so on and so forth. Are people reacting to those things? Are these the type of economic reforms that they would like to see?
I think when it comes to the messages of the president, most people kind of stick to the sort of the bread and butter issues, the issues that are closest to them. And so that's why we do see the discussion of grants, of jobs, and perhaps some of the bigger picture around what interventions could be made or what priorities should come is often sometimes there and sometimes explored by participants. But really the kind of, as I say, it's the bread and butter issues, those issues that are closest to people's hearts were the messages that people wanted to send to the president. Yeah.
So nobody wants to tell the president how to grow the economy. There are no suggestions to say, President, this is what you must do to the economy?
Well, of course, within the messages, of course, there are people that do have those kinds of suggestions. But what we do when we get this kind of data in is we try to find a way to quantify it, because obviously everyone has their own personal message that they want to make, and we try and find a way to group those together. So when we think about grouping those together, that's where we get these kind of headline results. If we were to probe deeper, and maybe this is what I should do with your urging, is to actually look more carefully at what people are saying in terms of what plan they would put on the table.
So, because I'm really interested to hear if whether people are saying there's a social consensus that, look, President, alleviate poverty, but is anybody saying to the president how you should alleviate poverty? Yes, give us more social grants, but where is that money going to come from? Because I suppose social grants would need to come from people paying more tax and the economy doing well. If we grow the GDP, there'll be more people, more companies paying tax, and therefore you will be able to pay those social grants and be able to pay them a little bit longer.
One of the things that is actually interesting from the survey is we have asked participants if they would support there being more taxes on wealthy people. And actually we find comparatively low levels of support for that kind of intervention. And that actually makes South Africa quite different from other countries when similar questions are posed. So it is a puzzle as to why that kind of intervention doesn't have widespread support in South Africa. But I think also what the findings demonstrate is that it's not a single solution to the problems that we face. It can't be a question of grants or jobs. It's obviously grants and jobs, and those are the kinds of plans that we do need to think about. It's not one or the other, it's about both.
Now, the other policy question that is currently being discussed is the question of the basic income grant. What is the highest level of support for that, and what have you found?
So what we found is we've been doing this survey for over a year now. We started in April 2020 and we've conducted the survey in 4 rounds. So what we found is in April 2020, this is where we had the highest levels of support for the introduction of a basic income grant. Now, in many ways, that makes a lot of sense, because at that point when we ran the survey, there wasn't the grant top-ups, there wasn't the social relief of distress grant, so there weren't other measures in place. What we found more recently is from the kind of higher levels of support that we saw during round 1, so in April 2020, where over 60% were supporting it. It's dropped a little and dropped down into sort of the mid-50s, so still supported by more than half. But the support has dropped just a little. And I think that does make sense, because that support changes in relation to what is happening around us. So the fact that we did have the top-ups, we did have the social relief of distress grant, but it is supported by still more than half. And of course, there are some differences in that support. Interestingly, it is the highest levels of support, if we look at, for instance, race, is amongst Indian and coloured respondents, much lower levels of support amongst Black Africans. And I think this can also be explained by, it's a difficult concept actually to think about a basic income grant. It's not actually something that we have, so people are trying to imagine what this thing would look like. And sometimes I think there is a concern that the introduction of a basic income grant may take away other grants or other protections that people have. And I think this can sometimes influence the views on the basic income grant. But overall, it is supported by more than half of adults in South Africa, which is what we can tell from the findings.
Yeah. Any patterns of support as far as the value is concerned, the 3,500, or what the amount is?
So these are not things that we've yet been able to probe in the survey, and is hopefully something that we could be able to do in a future round, as you know, the Ramaphosa has announced that the government is thinking about introducing a basic income grant, and in future rounds we could probably probe this further. Certainly in the messages to the President, as I've mentioned, you know, people did talk about 350, you know, as not being enough, and of course we do know that that 350 rand doesn't even meet the kind of bottom threshold of the food poverty line, with that threshold being about 585 rand a month. People are saying that it's not enough, but they are saying that it is something. It is something that is contributing. It's allowing them to survive in a way where it is, when it was taken away, was making life much, much more difficult for over 6 million South Africans, we have to remember, were in receipt of this grant. And this time round it will be more because of the extensions around who is eligible for the social relief of distress grant. So although the amount may be small, we may want it to be more, it is still a very, very important intervention.
Carin, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us tonight. Carin Runciman, Director of the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. In a moment.